In the golden age of the Roman Empire, power was worshipped more than the gods themselves. And in that world of marble palaces and poisoned goblets, a new name began to rise. Valyriia Maselina, the daughter of a nobleman, and a woman destined to change the fate of Rome forever. Valyria was born into luxury, but not love. Her father, Senator Marcus Massalinus, cared only for alliances and wealth. At 16, she was promised to Emperor Cassian Aurelius, a ruler twice her age, a marriage designed not for affection, but for control. Rome celebrated their union with parades, fireworks, and feasts that lasted 3 days. But beneath the glittering torches, whispers spread through the crowd. She has the eyes of a serpent. They say she smiles when others fall. Inside the palace, Valyria learned quickly. She watched how men in the Senate lied to one another with polite smiles, how slaves vanished for overheard secrets, and how the emperor's closest allies could be bought with flattery and fear. She was quiet, always watching, always listening. Within months, she knew which senators were weak, which generals were ambitious, and which servants carried messages through the night. And soon, she began to use them. To the emperor, she was graceful, obedient, the perfect wife. But when the torches dimmed, she ruled the palace from behind her silken veil. Letters written in code left her chambers at midnight. Spies brought her names of traitors and dissenters. Even the emperor's advisors began to report to her instead. By her 20th birthday, Valyria was no longer the emperor's bride. She was his shadow, whispering in his ear, guiding his every move. When the Senate opposed a new tax law, 3 of its loudest critics were found dead within the same week, their wine poisoned, their servants missing. Rome called it coincidence, but behind her golden mask, Valyria smiled. And that was when the empire began to fear her. Servants claimed she never slept, that her chambers were filled with strange incense and foreign symbols. Some said she met with Eastern mystics, men who promised her eternal youth in exchange for unspeakable rituals. No one dared to confront her. Even the emperor seemed to shrink in her presence, a puppet to his queen. But in the streets of Rome, the people had begun to talk. Who truly ruled the empire? The emperor on his throne, or the woman who never blinked when the heads of her enemies rolled? Because the rise of Empress Valyria Maselina had just begun, and soon all of Rome would kneel, not to a god, but to her. Rome had always been ruled by emperors, but now the whispers said it was ruled by her. Valyria Maselina had become the silent architect of the empire. Every decision the emperor made bore her invisible signature. When Cassian rewarded a general, it was because Valyria had whispered his name at dinner. When a senator was exiled, it was because she had found his weakness and turned it into a weapon. Power did not come to her all at once. It came through patience, through charm, precision, and a smile that could both seduce and destroy. She understood men better than they understood themselves. To the proud, she offered flattery. To the fearful, she promised safety. And to the ambitious, she gave opportunity, until their ambition grew too loud to ignore. And then she cut them down. Soon, her private chambers became the true center of power in Rome. Senators came there secretly at night, seeking favor or forgiveness. They left with promises, and with debts they could never repay. Even the emperor began to depend on her counsel. Cassian once believed himself a god among men, but under her gaze he became fragile, desperate for her approval, terrified of her silence. Valyria never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of consequence. When a rival noblewoman insulted her at a banquet, Valyria only smiled. Days later, the woman's husband was arrested for treason, on evidence that no one could trace. The message was clear. One insult could cost an empire. But the Empress's hunger grew. What began as survival became addiction. Each secret she controlled, each life she bent to her will, made her feel untouchable. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she had a secret council of women, widows, courtesans, and priestesses, who met in hidden chambers beneath the palace. Together, they guided Rome's destiny while men above argued over laws they no longer understood. Others swore. Valyria kept a book of names, enemies, allies, and those soon to fall. Every night, she would cross out one name in ink so dark it looked like blood. The emperor's generals began to fear her influence. His friends vanished, one by one. Yet Cassian, blind to the danger, called it loyalty. He believed his empire had never been stronger. But Rome itself began to rot from within. Justice turned into bribery. Fear became law. Senators who once ruled with pride now trembled when Valyria entered the hall, her eyes gliding over them like a blade seeking a throat. Still, there was something hollow in her triumph. At night, surrounded by gold and silence, Valyria felt the shadow she had created growing larger than herself. Power was a living thing, hungry, restless, never satisfied. And now it had begun to whisper to her. It told her that even an empress could be replaced. And somewhere, deep within the marble walls of the palace, someone had already begun to plan her fall. By the 5th year of her reign beside Emperor Cassian, Valyria Maselina's power was absolute, yet unseen. She ruled not through armies or decrees, but through fear, secrets, and the quiet obedience of those who had everything to lose. Rome itself had begun to change. The streets were quieter. The Senate spoke in whispers. Servants learned to look at the floor when her name was mentioned. And in the gilded corridors of the palace, it was said that even the statues seemed to watch her pass. Valyria had built her empire carefully, piece by piece. She placed loyal spies among the senators, courtesans, and guards. She controlled information like currency. Every confession, every betrayal, every careless word was stored in her memory and used when the time was right. The palace had become her labyrinth. Beneath its marble floors ran hidden tunnels, built centuries earlier by paranoid emperors. Valyria used them now for her private messengers. Shadows who moved at night, delivering orders sealed with her personal crest. None of them dared speak her name aloud. One evening, as the sun bled crimson over the Tiber, a senator named Lucian approached the Empress in secret. His hands trembled as he handed her a scroll. Inside was proof that the Emperor's most trusted general was plotting to seize power. Valyria read it in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were calm, unreadable. "You've done well," she said. "You may go." By morning, the general's estate had burned to the ground. His body was never found. Lucian soon discovered that silence was safer than gratitude. But Valyria's web of control came at a price. The people began to whisper that Rome was cursed, that the gods had turned their faces away. Storms battered the coast. Crops failed. Statues of the old gods were defaced with strange symbols. Priests called it divine punishment. The Empress called it nonsense, yet even she could feel something shifting. A coldness in the air, as if the empire itself had begun to fear her. Her enemies multiplied in the shadows. The Senate had grown restless. They resented taking orders from a woman, no matter how powerful. And the emperor, frail, paranoid, and haunted by her influence, had begun to withdraw into madness. He trusted no one, not even her. Valyria sensed it before anyone else. The change in his eyes, the hesitation in his voice. The emperor she had once controlled was slipping away, lost to suspicion and superstition. And yet, she could not stop. She began to act without his consent. New laws were signed in his name but written by her hand. Prisoners vanished without trial. Entire families were erased from history, their names carved out of the public records. Rome was now an empire of ghosts, and its empress, the woman who had once whispered her way to the throne, found herself surrounded by silence too deep to escape. She had built an empire of shadows, and in the end, she would learn that shadows have a way of turning on their maker. The empire Valyria Maselina, built on secrets, was beginning to fracture. The same fear that had once sustained her power now poisoned it. In the marble corridors where servants once bowed, murmurs now lingered. Whispers of rebellion, of betrayal, of an empress whose reach had finally gone too far. Valyria had felt it coming. The subtle hesitation in the guards' salutes, the sudden silence when she entered a room, the way her messages took longer to be returned. Her web was loosening. Someone, somewhere, was cutting its threads. The Emperor Cassian had become a ghost of a man, paranoid, sickly, and convinced that his palace walls were filled with spies. He stopped seeing his council, stopped addressing the Senate. His meals were tasted by slaves who rarely survived the week, and through it all, Valyria remained at his side. Outwardly calm, inwardly burning, she knew the Senate had begun to meet in secret. She knew that Cassian's own generals were being promised freedom, if they turned against her. One night, a messenger arrived bearing the Emperor's seal, a decree. It ordered Valyria's confinement to her private quarters, for the safety of the Empire. When she read it, she didn't shout. She only smiled faintly, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. "He finally believes he can rule without me," she whispered. How unfortunate. For him. For 2 days, she remained silent. The palace believed she had accepted her fate. But on the third night, the guards outside her doors were found dead, their throats cleanly cut. Valyria had escaped. For a week, Rome held its breath. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she fled to the eastern provinces. Others claimed she was hiding in the catacombs beneath the city. But the truth was far stranger. A senator named Gaius Corvinus, once her ally, now her hunter, led a secret operation to capture her. They found her at dawn, standing barefoot in the emperor's garden, surrounded by statues of long-dead rulers. She didn't resist when they took her. She only looked past them toward the horizon and said, "Empires fall, Senator, but power never dies. It only changes its name." That same evening, Emperor Cassian announced to the Senate that Valyria Maselina had taken her own life. Her body was never displayed, and her burial site was never revealed. But not everyone believed the story. Some claimed they saw her ship leaving the coast that night, a lone figure cloaked in black, sailing into the storm. Others whispered that the emperor himself died screaming her name weeks later, his mind broken by visions of her face. The empire moved on. Statues of Valyria were destroyed, her name erased from records. Yet the people still told stories of the empress who could not be killed, of the woman who ruled Rome from the shadows long after her death. Because in the heart of every ruler that came after, such were they, her ghost remained. Years passed, then decades, and still Rome could not forget the name Valyria Maselina, though every stone inscription that bore it had been shattered, and every scroll that mentioned her had been burned. Yet the people whispered, always in secret, always at night, because the empress might have vanished, but her shadow had not. In the heart of the imperial archives, historians wrote of her as a cautionary tale, the woman who rose too high, who reached beyond the limits of her time. But outside those halls, others told a different story. They said Valyria had not died at all. They said she lived on, somewhere beyond the Tiber, surrounded by loyal followers, waiting for Rome to crumble so she could return. And strangely, after her disappearance, the empire did begin to crumble. The Senate grew weaker, the provinces rebelled, the treasury drained into endless wars. Famine struck the countryside, and a series of earthquakes shook the capital itself. Priests claimed it was divine punishment, that Rome was cursed for spilling innocent blood. But the old women who sold herbs in the alleyways whispered something darker. The Empress cursed the throne before she left. They said that anyone who wore the imperial crown after Cassian would know betrayal, madness, or sudden death. And they were right. One by one, emperors fell, poisoned by their own guards, overthrown by their own generals, strangled by the same ambition Valyria had once mastered. In the ruins of her palace, strange things were reported. Servants claimed to hear footsteps in the empty halls, or to see a figure standing by the balcony where Valyria once watched the city burn. A woman in a black veil, her eyes like coals in the dark. One guard swore he saw her reflection in a marble pool, though no one stood beside him. Another claimed her voice still whispered through the corridors, "Power never dies." Over time, her legend changed. To some, she became a monster, a witch who sold her soul for influence. To others, a tragic heroine, a woman too clever, too fearless for a world ruled by men. And as centuries passed, even her enemies began to wonder whether Rome had ever been stronger than under her reign of fear, because she had ruled not just through cruelty, but through understanding the hearts of those who feared her most. In the end, her curse became prophecy. Rome, once the heart of the world, collapsed under the same hunger that had created her, and somewhere in the dust of time, her voice still seems to echo, soft, cold, unforgettable. Empires rise, empires fall, but those who learn to command desire rule forever. The story of Valyria Maselina ends where all power ends, not in blood, not in glory, but in the silence that follows her name. And if you walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill on a moonless night, they say you can still hear her footsteps, the Empress who refused to die.